Sir, you need to talk to me. Hand me your ID, now.
What's this about?
You're not detained, but you're not walking off. Show your ID.
If I'm not detained, the ID demand isn't a command, so which is it?
That folder, HIPAA violation. That's a felony.
This folder isn't a random patient's file. It's mine, and I'm internal
Turn
affairs.
that camera off.
This is one of those situations that starts off sounding almost ridiculous, until you realize how dangerous ridiculous can get when it's backed by a badge. And the scariest part? If one tiny detail hadn't changed, it could have ended very differently. Quick thing, tell us where you're watching from in the comments. What city or state? And if you like stories where power gets checked by facts, cameras, and calm boundaries, hit like and subscribe. Now back to it. Detective John Hale didn't look like he was there to cause trouble. He looked like a man trying to finish something and leave. Hands visible, shoulders steady, one palm resting on the folder like it was an anchor. Officer Miller acted like he'd been invited to take over the room. His voice carried on purpose. He told John he needed to talk for a second, loud enough that people waiting for blood work and discharge papers turned their heads. Behind the counter, Evan Ross, the receptionist, went pale in real time. He'd called for help, but he hadn't expected the temperature to jump this fast. John stayed calm. He asked what this was about. Officer Miller said Evan had reported John for harassing patients and trying to take a file without authorization. He stepped closer as he said it, closing distance, not to hear better, but to control the space. John didn't flinch. He pushed back on the accusation without raising his voice. He asked whose file Officer Miller thought it was. That should have slowed everything down. It didn't. Officer Miller demanded identification and labeled it a felony like the word itself did the work. His hand drifted toward his belt, not drawing anything, just making sure the lobby remembered he had the uniform and the tools. John responded with one clean question. Was he being detained? Officer Miller hesitated and tried to live in the middle. He said John wasn't being detained, but John cut him off. Still even, if he wasn't being detained, then the ID demand wasn't a command. So which was it? That's when the room sharpened. Not louder, just more aware. Because everyone had seen this before. You're free to go, said with the body language of try it. Officer Miller ignored the detention question and went back to the folder. He said John had taken a patient file without authorization. John tapped the folder lightly and corrected the premise. He said he wasn't taking a patient's file. He said he was handling official business. Officer Miller repeated official business with a tone that turned it into a joke. Then he said the quiet part out loud. John didn't look official. That line landed harder than the officer realized. It wasn't about policy. It was about perception. Evan Ross tried to intervene, clearly panicking now. He explained he only called because John had been asking questions and people got uncomfortable. And there it was. Not a crime. Not a clear threat. Discomfort. John didn't attack Evan. He named the problem. This was being built on vibes. Someone didn't like his tone at the counter, and suddenly the word harassment was being thrown around like it was a fact. Officer Miller didn't like hearing it framed that way. He told John not to get cute, and his eyes flicked to John's phone. John had been recording, not theatrically, not shoved in anyone's face, just held steady, angled down, capturing the interaction in a public lobby already covered by security cameras. Officer Miller pressured him about recording like the phone was the real offense. He ordered John to put it down. John refused, calmly, firmly. He framed it as documentation of a public interaction. Then he tightened the boundary again. If Officer Miller believed there was a crime, he needed to articulate it. If he was detaining John, he needed to say it. Otherwise, he needed to step back. That's when Officer Miller reached for a scary word he thought would force compliance. He pointed at the folder and declared it a HIPAA violation. John corrected the pronunciation without being dramatic. Then he pointed out the obvious. Officer Miller didn't even know what was in the folder. Officer Miller insisted he knew enough. In his mind, the mere act of holding the folder made it illegal. He kept repeating felony like it was a warning siren. This was the chess game right here. Officer Miller leaning on volume and vague legal threats. John refusing to give him anything he didn't have the authority to take. A charge nurse, Lila Nguyen, passed through the edge of the scene, slowed for half a second, and took in the details the way medical staff learn to. The tone, the distance, the phone recording, the fact that John's posture didn't match the story being told about him. John asked again, without spiraling into a lecture, whether this was detention or a voluntary conversation. Officer Miller still wouldn't answer cleanly. He kept pressing. He kept crowding. He kept treating Evan's discomfort like probable cause. And Evan Ross stood there watching his own decision turn into something bigger, realizing too late he hadn't reported a crime. He'd reported a feeling. John took a breath like he'd reached the end of patience, not anger. Something colder. Like someone who'd already decided how much time he was willing to waste. He told Officer Miller carefully that the best thing he could do right now was walk away. Officer Miller scoffed and pushed back, like he needed to win in front of the room. John paused. For the first time, the lobby saw something under the calm. Something heavy, like John was carrying a bigger situation than this argument. Then John moved his hand toward the hem of his shirt. Not fast, not aggressive. Just enough movement to trigger the part of Officer Miller's brain trained to react to hands near clothing. Officer Miller's stance shifted immediately. His voice dropped without him meaning to. In the lobby, patients, families, staff went quiet in that specific way public spaces did when they sensed an incident crossing from uncomfortable into dangerous. John lifted the edge of his shirt slightly. What he showed wasn't a weapon. It was an injury, bandaging and bruising near his side, fresh enough that it didn't look like an old story. Officer Miller stared at it, visibly recalculating. Evan Ross looked like someone realizing he'd called the police on the wrong person at the worst possible moment. Because whatever happened to John Hale, it didn't match harassing patients. It matched a different kind of work entirely. The moment Detective John Hale showed the bandage at his side, the confrontation stopped being a front desk complaint and started feeling like something the lobby wasn't supposed to be part of. Officer Grant Miller's posture changed first. The volume dropped. The confidence shifted into calculation, like he'd realized he might have walked into the wrong kind of situation. Hale didn't try to win the room. He didn't dramatize it. He simply stated that he'd been shot a few nights earlier during undercover work. No details, no war story. Just a fact that didn't match the story Evan Ross had called in. Miller's eyes went back to the folder, still trying to anchor the situation to something simple. Rules, paperwork, privacy. He kept circling the same accusation. Unauthorized file, hospital policy, serious charges. Hale corrected the assumption without raising his voice. He made it clear the folder wasn't a random patient's information. It was his. That single detail hit the lobby like a hard reset. Evan Ross looked like he understood in real time that he hadn't reported a crime. He'd escalated discomfort into a police intervention, and now it was attached to the wrong person. Hale then revealed the bigger issue in plain terms. He worked internal affairs, and he was there because there were signs someone inside the hospital was leaking sensitive law enforcement information. Not gossip, not paranoia. A real concern that had already caused damage. And suddenly, everything Officer Miller had been doing, demanding ID loudly, threatening charges, arguing in public, trying to control recording, looked worse. Not just rude, risky. Because if Hale was telling the truth, then the danger in that building wasn't a man with a folder. It was someone who benefited from attention being pointed in the wrong direction. Hale kept his phone recording, steady and quiet. He didn't wave it around. He didn't threaten to post anything. He just let the documentation exist, the way someone did when they knew how quickly people rewrote the story later. Miller asked how he was supposed to confirm any of this. Hale gave him a controlled answer. Confirmation could happen through proper channels, but not out loud in the middle of a hospital lobby, not in front of patients and staff, and not in a way that alerted whoever might be listening. That was when Miller finally stepped out of the command voice and into something closer to professionalism. He backed off. He acknowledged he didn't have the full picture. He apologized, not as a performance, but as a correction. Evan Ross tried to speak, but he was visibly shaken. He kept glancing between the uniform and the man he'd labeled suspicious, like he couldn't figure out how the situation had flipped so completely. A nurse drifting near the edge of the scene noticed the shift, too. The staff didn't need the full story to sense it. This wasn't a routine complaint anymore. This was law enforcement business that didn't belong in public conversation. Hale didn't punish the receptionist with words. He didn't comfort him either. He stayed on task. He returned to the counter and pushed the process forward, like this interruption was just another obstacle he'd anticipated. Miller, now aware of the cameras and the phone and the crowd, repositioned himself. He stopped hovering over Hale and started acting like a barrier against further chaos, keeping the space calm, lowering the temperature, making it easier for Hale to finish without more noise. The lobby's attention slowly scattered again, but the tension didn't disappear. It just moved under the surface. Because Hale hadn't come there to argue with a patrol officer. He'd come there to see who inside that building reacted the wrong way when he asked for his own file. And now, thanks to the disruption, whoever was leaking information, if Hale was right, had been given a warning that something was happening. Hale kept his focus on procedure, timing, and control. He didn't rush. He didn't get sloppy. He just kept moving. Because the real test wasn't whether he could win a lobby argument. It was whether the hospital would make a mistake. After Officer Grant Miller backed off, the lobby slowly went back to normal. People looked away and returned to their phones. The receptionist, Evan Ross, kept working, but he looked tense. Detective John Hale stayed calm and stayed on the task. He wasn't there to argue. He was there to see how the hospital handled a records request under pressure. He kept his phone recording quietly. He didn't announce it. He didn't point it at anyone's face. He just kept a clean timeline. Hale continued the request using the normal process. He filled out what they required. He followed the steps. He didn't ask for special treatment. That mattered because he wanted the hospital's response to be defensible and trackable. Evan Ross said he needed to involve a supervisor. He framed it as policy. Hale didn't fight that. A supervisor meant more names involved, more cameras, more system log entries. A supervisor came out and spoke in a calm, professional way. Hale kept his explanation general. He said he was requesting his own record and needed the standard process completed. He did not explain why he wanted it. He did not mention internal affairs again. He did not give extra details. Hale watched how staff responded to a simple request. Some staff acted normal and moved on. Others lingered near the records area longer than they needed to. One staff member stopped nearby without an obvious reason. Another walked past twice. None of that proved anything by itself, but Hale noted the timing. Evan Ross checked his phone under the counter. It was quick. Hale didn't accuse him of anything. People texted at work. But the timing stood out because it happened right after a police officer had confronted Hale in the lobby. The supervisor returned to the computer and said they needed a moment to confirm something in the system. Again, that could be routine. Hale stayed quiet and let them work, but he watched for unnecessary delays. Then a call came into the front desk. Evan answered. His face changed. He glanced at Hale, then at the supervisor, then away. The call ended quickly. Hale didn't ask who it was. He didn't demand to see the phone. He didn't raise his voice. He simply said he needed the process completed without further delays. That statement did two things. It kept the interaction calm in public. It created a clear point on the recording where Hale requested the standard process to continue. The supervisor pushed the request forward. A few minutes later, Hale received what he came for through the official process. Hale checked the paperwork for names and timestamps. His phone recording captured the handoff. Officer Miller stayed back and didn't interfere again. He looked uncomfortable, but he kept the area quiet, which helped. Hale left without rushing. Outside the lobby, he focused on what mattered: the staff reactions, the phone activity he saw, the unexpected call, and the exact times. Those details were what Internal Affairs could compare to access logs and camera footage later. Once the hospital access logs came back, John Hale's case stopped being about a heated lobby interaction and became what it should have been from the start: a traceable sequence of actions tied to specific accounts, terminals, and times. The hospital system showed the normal steps for a standard record request. It also showed one action that didn't fit. During the same window when the front desk had taken an unexpected call and the receptionist's demeanor shifted, a user account opened sections of Hale's chart that weren't necessary to process a routine release. It wasn't a harmless click. It was a deeper look than procedure required. Internal Affairs didn't jump to conclusions. They did what they always did. They compared it against patterns. They pulled the last few weeks of access history, tied to the same workstation and the same user credentials, then compared those timestamps to other incidents where undercover details had surfaced too early. They looked for the simplest explanation first: training issue, curiosity, or sloppy procedure. But the timing wasn't random. It clustered around moments when police-related patients came through the hospital, and it clustered around moments when staff had no legitimate reason to dig deeper. They interviewed the staff member tied to the access. The employee tried to explain it as routine verification. They said they were following policy, that the system sometimes required extra steps, that they were just making sure the release was correct. IA didn't argue. They took the statement, thanked them, and moved on. Then they pulled the hospital's written policy and matched it line by line against what the employee claimed. The routine verification explanation didn't match what the policy required. The policy didn't require opening those sections. The policy didn't require that level of access. IA now had a gap between the story and the system. At that point, the hospital's compliance department got involved. They had their own reasons to treat this seriously. A staff member accessing records without a proper purpose wasn't just a rumor problem. It was a regulatory problem. It exposed the hospital to real liability. Internal Affairs made it clear that they weren't there to punish normal staff who were caught in the middle of a tense day. They were there to identify whether sensitive law enforcement information was being exposed. They requested the front desk phone logs for the exact time window when the call came in and changed how the receptionist behaved. The hospital provided the incoming number information for the desk line. The incoming call didn't come from a patient family member or another department. It came from an outside number that didn't belong in the hospital workflow. IA then did the next step the proper way. They obtained legal authority to connect the dots outside the hospital. They didn't seize phones without cause. They didn't do hallway interrogations. They used the process that held up in court. When the phone number was run through the right channels, it linked to a person already flagged in a separate gang intelligence file. Not the top of a crew, but someone known for coordinating information and passing messages. Someone who benefited from advance notice when law enforcement activity was near. That's when the hospital leak stopped being a theory. Internal Affairs went back to the staff member tied to the unusual access and brought them in again, this time with a clearer timeline. They didn't threaten, they didn't raise their voices, they presented the verified facts. The exact access timestamps, the exact sections opened, the exact call time to the front desk, and the exact time the staff member's account took the unusual action. The staff member denied intent again, but the denial got thinner. They claimed they never contacted anyone. They claimed they didn't message anyone. They claimed they didn't even know why a gang-related number would be calling the desk line. IA didn't debate it. They followed the trail. They pulled additional camera footage. Not just the lobby-wide view, but angles that showed the desk area, hand movements, and whether a personal phone was in use. It wasn't perfect, but it showed enough to contradict the clean version of events. It showed a quick look down and a brief thumb movement consistent with a message being typed. At the same time, Iowa checked whether the hospital system flagged break glass access. Many systems logged when staff opened protected records without standard need. The hospital system showed those protected accesses were happening more than once, and not only for Hale. That created the next step, a controlled test. Internal Affairs coordinated with the hospital and set a monitored scenario that looked routine on the surface. It didn't involve fake emergencies or complicated setups. It involved a record that would only be accessed by someone who was looking for it, not processing it. They monitored which accounts touched it, which screens were opened, and whether any outside call or message followed. The same account touched it. The same pattern followed. And within minutes, a phone number linked to the same gang contact received a message from a device connected to the employee's personal line. That was enough. At that stage, the case moved out of internal review and into criminal exposure. Internal Affairs brought the district attorney's office into the loop and presented the evidence package. Hospital access logs, policy comparisons, camera footage, phone records obtained through proper process, and the controlled test results. The DA's office didn't need a dramatic confession. They needed a story supported by records. Now, the original reason John Hale had come to the hospital clicked into place. He wasn't there because he wanted special treatment. He was there because he needed to see who would react the wrong way when his name entered the system. The lobby confrontation had been an interference, but it hadn't stopped the trap from working. It just made the time window more obvious. As the hospital leak case progressed, Iowa also looped back to the undercover operation that got Hale shot. They reviewed how his identity had been exposed and whether the hospital leak had contributed directly. They didn't claim what they couldn't prove, but they showed that sensitive information had been moving from the medical side to street contacts, and that movement created a serious risk to any officer whose name appeared in those records. The gang contact tied to the phone number was arrested as well. Charges depended on what the DA could prove: conspiracy, obstruction, and any related offenses tied to violence or intimidation. IA didn't promise the maximum penalty in public. They focused on securing convictions that would stick. Officer Grant Miller's part of the story didn't disappear either. His department reviewed his conduct in the lobby based on dispatch audio, camera footage, and Hale's phone recording. The review wasn't about embarrassing him. It was about whether he had used legal language accurately and whether he had escalated based on assumptions. The conclusion was straightforward. He had treated a voluntary encounter like it wasn't voluntary, threatened felony consequences without confirming key facts, and tried to stop recording without proper cause. He wasn't charged with a crime, but he didn't walk away untouched. He received formal counseling and corrective training. His supervisor documented the incident and required him to complete training on detentions versus consensual contact, public recording rights, and how to handle medical privacy claims without inventing criminal authority. The department also updated its guidance for responding to hospital calls, so officers didn't keep using HIPAA like a threat when what they really meant was, the hospital has a policy. Miller also personally apologized to Hale again later, away from the lobby. Not because an apology fixed everything, but because it mattered to acknowledge what he had done. He had put pressure on the wrong person and helped create a public disturbance in a sensitive environment. Hale didn't accept or reject it dramatically. He treated it like a professional correction and moved forward. For Hale, the outcome wasn't satisfying in the way viral clips make things look satisfying. He still had a healing wound. He still had a case that involved real risk. But he got something that mattered more than a moment of dominance. The leak path was identified, documented, and shut down through a process that could hold up. There were ripple effects beyond the arrests and terminations. The hospital changed how it trained front desk staff and supervisors. Calling police became a last resort tied to specific behaviors, not discomfort. Staff were coached to distinguish between someone being firm and someone being threatening. They added better escalation options that didn't involve handing the situation to a uniform who might escalate it further. The records department tightened permissions, expanded audit alerts, and made it harder for any single staff member to explore chart sections without a documented need. On the law enforcement side, the department's training emphasized something basic but often ignored. Authority didn't replace accuracy. Officers were reminded that if they couldn't articulate a legal basis, they couldn't force compliance by volume. They were also reminded that hospitals were public-facing spaces full of vulnerable people, and unnecessary escalation there did more harm than good. The last piece of the story was quieter. A few weeks later, Hale returned to the hospital for a follow-up appointment like any other patient. This time, there was no scene, no shouting, no crowd watching. Just a man walking through a lobby that had learned the hard way what happens when assumptions get treated like facts. And if you think about it, that was the real lesson. The most dangerous situations weren't always the ones that looked dangerous at first. Sometimes the danger started with someone saying they just wanted to be safe, then using that feeling to justify control over someone they didn't understand. That's how bias becomes policy. That's how policy becomes pressure. And that pressure in the wrong moment can ruin lives and compromise real investigations. So here's the question for you. If you were standing in that lobby and you saw an officer demanding ID without a clear detention, and you saw a calm person recording and holding boundaries, what would you have assumed was happening? Would you have trusted the uniform automatically? Or would you have waited for facts? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if you've ever seen rules used as a weapon against someone who didn't fit the image people expected, share your experience too. And make sure you subscribe for more story times where calm, documentation, and accountability are what finally win.
She grabbed my arm. I need you to do something right now before she deletes it and posts me online.
Okay, me exactly what happened, start to finish.
She rolled up with music, got disrespectful, called me racist, and then she grabbed me. I want this handled.
Stay right here with me. Don't walk toward her.
I'm telling you.
Separately.
Tell me what happened from your side and keep it simple.
He ordered me to turn my music off like he owned the place. Shouted racist phrases at me.
Did you touch him at any point? Grab his arm?
No, I didn't touch him. Not once.
She's lying. She grabbed my arm.
Do you have video of the interaction?
Yes, right here. I've been recording.
Turn around, hands behind your back.
Janelle Carter kept her phone up at chest level, steady like she'd done it 100 times, while Chase Whitaker stood a few feet closer than he needed to, talking fast, louder than the music ever was. He was telling the responding officers that she had grabbed his arm and attacked him, and he wanted them to do something right now, before she deleted everything and posted him online. This is one of those situations that starts off sounding almost ridiculous, until you realize how dangerous ridiculous can get when it's backed by a badge. And the scariest part? If one tiny detail hadn't changed, it could have ended very differently. Before we rewind, tell me where you're watching from, country or state, in the comments. And if you're into stories where cameras, receipts, and calm boundaries beat loud accusations, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. It happened at a Love's gas station on August 29th, 2025. One of those bright, always busy travel stops where people come and go like background noise. Plenty of cameras, plenty of witnesses, and plenty of room for a small confrontation to turn into a police report. Janelle was known there, not famous, just familiar. Staff recognized her face, her car, the way she came in, grabbed what she needed, and left without drama. She wasn't the type employees had to watch, and that mattered later more than anyone realized at the start. Chase wasn't a regular to the staff in the same way. That didn't mean anything by itself, but it meant nobody at the store had a pre-built story about him. So when he started giving officers a confident version of events, the only thing backing it up was his voice. The call that brought police out was a battery complaint. Chase had reported that a woman had battered him. He described her outfit purple and her car, black Mercedes. He said she pulled up with loud music, cursed at him, called him racist, threatened to put him on social media, then grabbed his arm. He told dispatch he wanted officers to hurry. That hurry part wasn't accidental. Chase was trying to control the pace before anyone could slow the story down and test it. When officers arrived, he leaned into urgency. His body language said he wanted them to treat the situation like it was already decided. He kept circling back to the same points: loud music, disrespect, being called racist, and the arm grab. He framed it like he was minding his business and got attacked for it. Janelle's posture stayed different. She didn't perform panic. She didn't do the dramatic hands-up innocence act either. She gave what sounded like a timeline, not a speech. According to her, the music wasn't blasting. She said Chase had aggressively ordered her to turn it off, and it wasn't a request, it was a command. She said he followed her, staying in her space, and she started recording because she didn't trust what he might claim later. She denied touching him at all. And she said the first time he described it as her hitting or grabbing him was after officers were already on scene. That last detail is the kind of detail that can change everything. Because in a lot of parking lot calls, the first story officers hear becomes the default story. Whoever seems calmer gets believed. Whoever sounds most certain gets believed. Whoever uses the right keywords gets believed. But Officer Luis Ramirez and Officer Shannon Price didn't lock onto Chase's certainty. They did something simple that a lot of people don't expect in the middle of a messy accusation. They looked for proof. Janelle already had her phone video. She didn't act like it was a weapon. She treated it like a seatbelt, something you hope you never need, but you're glad you put it on. While one officer kept both parties separated, the other watched the clip, and the video didn't match the claim. On the recording, Chase was seen making the accusation that Janelle had grabbed him, while Janelle was clearly not within arm's reach. Officers estimated she was about 10 feet away when he said it. Not 2 feet. Not close enough for a quick grab. 10 feet. That doesn't just poke a hole in a story. It changes what the story is. Now, the incident wasn't simply a dispute about music. It wasn't even just a disagreement about who was rude first. It became a question of whether Chase had called 911 and accused someone of battery without it happening. And while the officers were processing that, the store employees started adding context. Devin Pike, one of the employees working that shift, told officers Janelle was a regular and didn't cause problems. Another staff member backed it up. Then the shift manager, Tina Alvarez, got involved and told officers she could call a manager to access surveillance footage because there were cameras pointed at the pumps and a good chance the area was covered. That offer mattered. It signaled that the store wasn't afraid of what the cameras would show. It signaled confidence. Chase, meanwhile, didn't have any footage. He didn't have a witness stepping up for him. He had his claim. And then he admitted something that officers often listen for. He had no video proof of her grabbing his arm. In a world where everybody's phone is always out, that's not automatically a lie. Plenty of real incidents don't get recorded, but here, the person he was accusing did have a recording, and it contradicted him in a clean, measurable way. Distance. This is where the power chess part shows up. Chase had tried to use the system as leverage. He used key phrases that make police move fast: battery, aggressor, hurry, threat to post online. He pushed the idea that he was being targeted and harassed. But Janelle's move wasn't louder. It was cleaner. Record first. Speak second. Keep space. Let the facts carry the weight. The officers didn't rush to make her prove she didn't do it. They did what they were supposed to do: compare statements to evidence. And once the evidence didn't match Chase's allegation, the direction of the call flipped. Instead of treating Janelle like a suspect, officers started treating Chase's report like the potential offense. He wasn't just mistaken. The accusation was specific. He said she grabbed his arm. He called 911 for it. He wanted immediate action. Yet the only video in play showed him making the claim while she was too far away to have done what he said. That's not a gray area, that's math. At that point, Officers detained Chase. His tone shifted, less certainty, more frustration. The officers stayed procedural. They weren't debating him. They were documenting. He was arrested for making a false report. On top of that, he was cited for disorderly conduct and obstruction, based on how he acted during the investigation and response. Janelle wasn't celebrated. She wasn't treated like a hero. She was treated like what she was, the person who didn't lie, didn't escalate, and had receipts. Before officers cleared the scene, they gave her contact information and asked her to send any additional videos she had for the case. That detail is important too. It showed they were building the report around evidence, not around whoever shouted first. And just like that, a moment that could have gone sideways at a gas station ended with the person who made the accusation being the one put in cuffs. As soon as Chase Whitaker realized the call wasn't going the way he expected, his whole strategy changed. A minute earlier, he'd been pushing urgency, trying to make the officers treat his story like it was already proven. But the second officer, Luis Ramirez, pointed out the distance issue on Janelle Carter's video. Chase stopped acting like the victim of a battery and started acting like someone trying to talk his way out of consequences. He began reframing. He leaned into the idea that the whole thing was a misunderstanding. He tried to make it about feelings instead of facts. He tried to make it about respect again. But police reports don't run on vibes. They run on timelines. Officer Shannon Price did what good officers do in messy public disputes. She separated the noise from the measurable. She kept asking the same kinds of questions: where everyone stood when the supposed contact happened, how it happened, what came before it, and what proof existed of any of it. Chase's answer kept landing in the same place. He didn't have proof of the arm grab, and the only video being shown didn't support his claim. And Janelle didn't try to win the conversation. She stayed in her lane. She kept her voice level. She kept space between herself and Chase. She let the record speak. That's the part a lot of people don't understand until they're in it. Calm isn't weakness. Calm is control. While Chase was detained, the store side of the story got even clearer. Devin Pike and shift manager Tina Alvarez weren't trying to take sides emotionally. They were doing something more useful than that. They were offering context and access. They explained to the officers that Janelle was a regular who didn't cause problems. Not perfect, not an angel, just consistent. The kind of customer who didn't bring drama into their store. That alone didn't prove innocence. But it mattered because it lowered the odds that she randomly snapped into violence at a pump. Then Tina made the next move that pushed the whole situation from a parking lot argument into a documented case. She initiated the process to get surveillance. Love's Locations didn't just hand footage out to anybody, and Tina knew it. She called for a manager and started the standard chain to access camera angles. The officers didn't treat it like overkill. They treated it like confirmation. Because if the cameras showed no physical contact, then this was bigger than a rude exchange. It was a false report with a named person and a serious allegation. And here's something people don't talk about enough. A false report doesn't just waste time. It puts a target on someone who didn't do anything. It invites escalation. It can become an arrest that never should have happened. That's why the tiny detail mattered so much. The distance on the phone video. If Janelle hadn't been recording, the officers would have been standing there with two competing stories and one person insisting he was attacked. In plenty of places, that's enough to make the wrong decision in the moment. Instead, the officers had a clip that froze reality. When Chase was taken into custody, it didn't look dramatic. It looked procedural. He was searched, handcuffed, and walked to the patrol vehicle. The energy at the pump dropped immediately once he was no longer controlling the scene with his voice. Janelle didn't celebrate. She didn't perform relief for anyone. She looked like someone who'd just dodged something she didn't want to think about. Officer Ramirez gave her contact information and instructions for sending over any additional recordings. He also explained what would likely happen next in the simplest terms, because the next part is where people get lost. reports, evidence uploads, statements, follow-up calls, court dates if needed. Tina and Devin stayed nearby, not hovering, just present. It mattered that Janelle wasn't standing alone while paperwork got finished. It mattered that witnesses were willing to attach their names to what they'd observed, that she wasn't the problem customer, and that they were confident enough to push for camera footage. And meanwhile, Chase's original 911 call wasn't just floating in the air anymore. It became part of the case file. His words, how urgent he sounded, how sure he acted, how he described the alleged battery, were now evidence too. Back at the station, the pieces started lining up in a way Chase probably didn't anticipate. Officers had a false allegation of battery tied to a specific person, a phone video that contradicted the key claim, on-scene admission that he had no video proof, store employees willing to support the idea that the accused person wasn't creating problems, pending surveillance access that could further confirm or deny physical contact. That's not a messy he said, she said. That's a case with an obvious direction. And this is where viewers should ask themselves something. How many people have had the opposite outcome just because they didn't think to record? Over the next couple of days, the incident didn't disappear. Gas station staff talked. Regulars talked. People who weren't even there started hearing the story in pieces, first as gossip, then as a warning. But Janelle didn't run to social media immediately, even though Chase had tried to paint her like someone who would. She focused on the boring part, sending the videos to the officers, saving backups, and writing down everything she remembered while it was still fresh. Time, location, who said what, where everyone stood. That's what accountability actually looks like. Not a viral clip, a clean record. Chase, on the other hand, had a different kind of record being built around him now. His charge for making a false report wasn't just a slap on the wrist. It meant he'd have to answer for why he escalated a confrontation into a criminal accusation without proof. And once a prosecutor saw that phone video detail, the claim happening while the accused stood about 10 feet away, there was no way to pretend it was just confusion. The system doesn't always protect the right person, but when evidence is this clear, it becomes harder for anyone to ignore. And that's where the real consequences started. When Chase Whitaker's case hit court, he didn't look like the guy who demanded officers hurry. He looked like someone who'd finally realized that a 911 call didn't disappear just because the moment was over. The prosecutor didn't need a dramatic angle. The file already had a clean timeline. Chase had called police from the Loves on August 29, 2025, and reported a battery. He had identified Janelle Carter by outfit and car. He had described an arm grab as the reason for the call. Then, when officers arrived, Janelle had a phone recording that showed Chase repeating the allegation while she was clearly several steps away. Store employees had backed up that she was a regular who didn't cause trouble, and surveillance access had been initiated to confirm what the officers were already seeing. The physical contact claim didn't match reality. Chase tried to turn it into a story about disrespect and being embarrassed. He leaned on the argument that he felt threatened and reacted in the moment. But the court kept dragging it back to one point. He didn't report a feeling. He reported a specific act of violence. And when the judge looked at how the allegation was made, how it changed, and what the evidence showed, the case became about accountability for using the system as a weapon. The result wasn't a movie ending. It was the kind of ending that follows people quietly. Chase dealt with the consequences of being charged for a false report. The disorderly conduct and obstruction issues followed him too, tied to how he behaved during the response once officers started checking his story instead of accepting it. Court costs, penalties, and a case record were the kind of consequences that didn't go viral, but absolutely changed what future paperwork and background checks would look like. While Chase tried to manage fallout, Janelle did something that mattered more than arguing with anyone afterward. She treated the whole thing like a lesson in preserving proof. She submitted every video clip she had in full, with original timestamps intact. She saved backups in more than one place. She requested the incident report through the proper process and kept the confirmation trail. She wrote down the names connected to the case: Officer Luis Ramirez, Officer Shannon Price, Sergeant Dane Holt, plus the Love's staff who stepped up: Tina Alvarez and Devin Pike. Not to build a social media moment, to build a record. She also contacted Love's corporate customer relations, not to blame the store, but to make sure the location's cooperation and surveillance process were documented from the business side too. That move mattered because companies pay attention when an incident shows they could be pulled into liability or public scrutiny later. Love's didn't dismiss her. The store staff had done the right thing. They stayed neutral, offered surveillance access, and helped stabilize the situation by backing facts instead of drama. Inside that Love's after August 29th, the atmosphere shifted in small ways. Employees got quicker about pulling a manager in when someone started trying to control another customer. They stopped brushing off early warning signs like aggressive commands, following too close, and escalating a petty argument into a police-level accusation. Tina made sure staff understood the difference between a loud customer and a customer trying to use authority as a threat. Janelle didn't walk away thinking the world had suddenly become fair. She walked away knowing one ugly truth and one useful truth. The ugly truth was that she could do everything right and still be accused. The useful truth was that documentation could keep an accusation from turning into handcuffs. That night could have ended differently if one tiny detail hadn't been there. Video showing distance, clearly enough that nobody could pretend it was a mystery. So here's what this story really teaches. When someone tries to turn a personal confrontation into a police problem, staying calm is only half the battle. The other half is preserving the truth in a way the system can't ignore. Now let me ask you, if you were in Janelle's position, would you have started recording right away? Or would you have assumed the truth would speak for itself? Drop your answer in the comments, and if you want more story times where receipts beat loud accusations and accountability actually shows up, hit like, share this with someone who needs it, and subscribe for more.
We need to check your belongings.
I do not consent to a search. Get a supervisor.
Ma'am, stop resisting. These credentials are fake.
This looks like impersonation.
The hallway was already empty when it turned into a checkpoint. Judge Alana Pierce was in a dark judicial robe, her tote on one shoulder, her phone in her hand, and the long day exhaustion still sitting behind her eyes. She'd cleared the last security door and was walking through the exit corridor, the part of the federal courthouse that was supposed to lead straight out. That's when two officers stepped in from the side, like they'd been waiting for someone to pass. The first one, Officer Edward Danner, positioned himself in the narrowest part of the corridor. The second, Officer Tyler Reese, stood a half step behind him, angled like a backup plan. And in seconds, the whole space changed. Danner started with what sounded like casual questions, but his body language didn't match casual. He kept his stance squared, eyes fixed, voice controlled in that way that wasn't friendly. It was measuring. Reese kept scanning the area like he expected her to run. Pierce kept moving at a normal pace until Danner made it clear she wasn't getting by. She calmly explained who she was and why she was there. A federal judge finishing a late day, leaving the building like everyone else. They didn't shift. They didn't soften. They didn't step aside. Instead, they pressed harder, wanting details, wanting her destination, wanting her job said in the exact phrasing they would accept. And when she didn't play along with the tone change, the questions started acting like orders. The moment it stopped being awkward and became something else was when Danner demanded identification and then didn't give it back. Pierce stayed composed because she understood what this was turning into. Not a misunderstanding, not a mix-up, a power move. Danner looked at her ID, then at her face, then back at the ID again, like the facts were optional. Reese shifted closer, closing the corridor space behind her, subtle, but not subtle enough. Pierce didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue emotionally. She did what people with real authority do when they're being tested by fake authority. She narrowed it down to procedure. She asked if she was being detained and on what basis. And that's when Danner made the situation official without using the official word, by telling her she wasn't leaving until they verified who she really was. Narrator voice. Engaging phrase. This is one of those situations that starts off sounding almost ridiculous until you realize how dangerous ridiculous can get when it's backed by a badge. And the scariest part, if one tiny detail hadn't changed, it could have ended very differently. Before we rewind, drop where you're watching from. Country, state, city, wherever. And if you watch stories about accountability, power games, and people staying calm when the system tries to bully them, hit like and subscribe because this one shows exactly why evidence matters. Now, here's how it started. It was late Tuesday night, the kind of late where the courthouse air felt stale and the building sounded bigger than it was. Most offices were dark. The staff that stayed past normal hours moved quietly and fast, like everyone was trying to finish their work without becoming anyone else's problem. Judge Alana Pierce had been inside since early morning. She wasn't a celebrity judge. She wasn't the type who walked around with an entourage. She was known for being prepared, direct, and unshakably professional, especially in a building full of people who tried to test boundaries for a living. That day had run long for reasons that weren't dramatic, just real. Hearings that stacked up, last-minute filings, a late motion that couldn't wait, and a final set of notes she refused to leave unfinished. The courthouse didn't shut down just because it was night. It just got thinner. Fewer eyes, fewer witnesses, more room for someone to do something wrong and claim nobody saw it. By the time she wrapped up, her robe was still on because she'd been moving from one task to the next, and she didn't think it mattered. It shouldn't have mattered. A judicial robe in a federal courthouse isn't a costume. It's not ambiguous. But Pierce also knew something most people learn the hard way. Uniforms don't protect you from bias. Sometimes they trigger it. She took the same exit route she always used after a late evening, the corridor that runs past the security screening area and funnels employees and authorized personnel toward the doors. Cameras covered it. Procedures existed. It was supposed to be clean. And as she approached the security exit corridor, she noticed something small at first. The usual overnight rhythm felt off. The security desk area wasn't busy, but it wasn't relaxed either. 2 officers she didn't recognize were posted near the exit zone, talking with that quiet intensity people get when they're bored, but still want to feel in control. Officer Edward Danner had the posture of someone who enjoyed being the final gate. Officer Tyler Reese had the energy of someone trying to prove he belonged next to Danner. Pierce didn't think about them for more than a second, because she had no reason to. She was in her workplace. She had access. She belonged there. And then, the second she passed the point where the corridor narrowed, Danner stepped in. At first, it looked like routine engagement, an officer acknowledging someone leaving late. But within moments, the tone turned. Not openly hostile. Worse than that. Suspicious. Danner's "Where are you headed?" turned into "Why are you here this late?" and then into "What exactly do you do here?" The pace of the questions didn't match safety. It matched testing. Pierce answered in a controlled, professional way. She stated she worked in law at the courthouse and was leaving after a long day. That should have ended it. Instead, Danner escalated like her calm made him angry. He demanded identification as if she'd just wandered in from the street. Pierce gave it because she had nothing to hide and because she also understood the reality. Refusing an ID request from someone determined to make a scene rarely ends well for the person without a weapon. The ID matched her name. Her credentials were real. Everything lined up. And Danner still didn't hand it back. He stared at it like he was hoping the plastic would change its mind. Reese leaned in and added a pressure. Questions about why she was alone, why she was out so late, whether she'd been drinking. Not because there was any sign of that. Because it's a humiliation tactic that's easy to say and hard to disprove in the moment. Pierce didn't take the bait. She didn't try to prove herself by over-explaining. She did what she did on the bench. She focused on the rules. She pushed back and measured terms, making it clear she wasn't required to answer random escalating questions without lawful reason. She pointed out that holding her ID and blocking the exit corridor was not a casual conversation anymore. And that's when Danner shifted into the most common cover language used in moments like this. He claimed they needed to verify her identity. But the real truth was simpler. He didn't believe she could be who she said she was. And he didn't want to admit he was wrong. Officer Edward Danner kept Judge Alana Pierce's ID in his hand, like it belonged to him now. He didn't step aside. He didn't return it. He didn't do the normal thing. Read it, confirm it, move on. Instead, he held the corridor. Officer Tyler Reese moved to Pierce's other side, not close enough to touch her, but close enough that the message was clear. She wasn't walking out unless they allowed it. Pierce stayed still. She didn't try to push past them. She didn't raise her voice. She kept her tone even and repeated what mattered. She worked in the building, her ID was valid, and she was leaving. Danner answered by adding more questions, not security questions, control questions. He pushed for where she was going, why she was out late, and what she was really doing in the courthouse after hours. Then he moved to the kind of accusation that's meant to embarrass and destabilize. Whether she'd been drinking. Pierce didn't argue about the insult. She corrected the process. She made it clear she wasn't required to answer random personal questions, and that holding her ID while blocking her path was not a voluntary conversation anymore. That's when Danner used the word he thought protected him. Verification. He claimed the ID didn't look right, and said they needed to verify her. He still didn't give a real reason. He didn't point to a policy. He didn't cite a call from inside. He didn't say there was a threat, a report, or a violation. He just said they were verifying. The problem was simple. In that corridor with her exit blocked and her ID withheld, verify meant detain, without saying the word. Pierce stayed controlled and asked for a supervisor. Reese responded by tightening the space again, turning his body so the corridor felt smaller. It wasn't a tackle. It wasn't a hand on her arm. It was the kind of positioning that lets people later say, nobody forced anything, while still making it clear you're not free. Pierce didn't flinch. She didn't plead. She did what she knew would matter later. She started tracking details in her mind, time, location, badge numbers, the fact that her ID was being held, the fact that she asked for a supervisor, the fact that they were blocking the exit. Danner didn't like that she stayed calm. So he changed tactics. He moved from questions to action. He told her they needed to check her belongings. Pierce did not consent. She told him clearly she wasn't giving permission for a search and asked again for a supervisor because she understood what was happening. Once the search happens, they can claim they found cause after the fact. Danner didn't stop. He reached for her purse. It happened fast and it happened messy. Not a careful check, not a respectful inspection. He grabbed the purse, pulled it open, and dumped it onto the courthouse floor. Her personal items scattered. Keys, phone charger, a few papers, small everyday things that had nothing to do with any crime. The corridor lights made it all look worse, like a staged scene. Then the credentials fell out. Her federal judicial identification and courthouse credentials slid across the floor in plain view. This was the moment where a professional officer would pause. This was the moment where a normal person would feel embarrassed and back off. This was the moment where the entire situation could have ended with a quick apology and an awkward walkaway. But Danner didn't apologize. He went the other direction. He picked up the credentials, stared at them, and instead of admitting he was wrong, he tried to turn it into a bigger accusation. He claimed the judge credentials were fake. Then he escalated it into the one accusation that would justify everything he'd already done if people believed it. He implied she was impersonating a judge. Reese backed him immediately, like agreeing would make it true. And that's when Pierce understood the risk level changed. Because once someone decides to protect themselves with a false story, the goal is no longer to check facts. The goal is to build a narrative that makes them look justified. Pierce didn't argue in circles. She didn't beg them to believe her. She didn't start explaining her career history. She did the most important thing she could do in that moment. She quietly started recording, not in a dramatic way, not announced as a threat, just a calm decision because she knew what came next. Radio traffic, selective wording, and official claims that would be hard to fight without evidence. Right after she started recording, Danner began talking over the radio. He didn't describe it as a judge being stopped in the courthouse. He framed it as a suspicious person, late-night credentials in question, refusing to cooperate. He called for backup. And in that corridor, with her items on the floor and her exit blocked, Pierce realized the incident was no longer about who she was. It was about what they could claim she was. After Officer Edward Danner called for backup, the corridor stopped feeling like an empty hallway and started feeling like a staged scene. Officer Tyler Reese kept his position tight, staying close enough to control Judge Alana Pierce's movement without putting hands on her. Danner stayed focused on building a version of events that sounded official enough to survive questions later. Pierce didn't give them what they wanted. She didn't get loud. She didn't panic. She didn't start explaining her resume like she was on trial in a hallway. She stayed still, kept her tone level, and quietly recorded. Because she understood something most people don't realize until it's too late. Once officers start talking on the radio like you're a suspect, the incident stops being about the truth and becomes about what they can document first. The first wave of additional officers arrived and took their cues from Danner's posture. The energy came in ready to treat Pierce like a problem. But then a supervisor-level presence showed up who didn't match that energy at all. Detective Serena Holt. Holt took in the whole scene before speaking. The robe, the scattered items on the floor, the narrow exit corridor, the fact that two officers were acting like they had a suspect, but the suspect looked like someone who belonged in the building more than they did. Holt didn't argue with Danner. She didn't accuse him. She didn't give him a stage. She asked for the ID and credentials. Danner hesitated, but he handed them over. At that point, there were witnesses nearby and cameras above. He didn't control the narrative alone anymore. Holt looked at the credentials, then looked at Pierce, then made a verification call through the courthouse system. It was quick, direct, and final. The confirmation came back clean. Pierce was who she said she was. The credentials were real, the job matched, the access matched. The story Danner was building couldn't survive contact with a basic internal check. That was the exact moment the whole situation changed. Not because anyone suddenly felt guilty, because now the risk shifted from how do we control her to how do we explain what we did? Holt didn't let them skip past the main issue. She pressed for what legal reason they had for stopping Pierce, taking her identification, blocking the corridor, and dumping her purse without consent. Danner tried to hide behind vague language, security, verification, policy. But Holt treated that the way experienced investigators treat it, like noise. She focused on concrete facts. There was no report of a threat. Pierce was leaving through a controlled exit route. She produced identification. There was no lawful basis to turn the interaction into a detention. And once they searched her property without consent, the situation moved from unprofessional to unlawful. Pierce didn't celebrate. She didn't insult them. She didn't need to. She simply gathered her belongings off the floor piece by piece, slow and steady, while courthouse staff watched. The night security lead, Mr. Ortega, had stepped closer by then, and his expression said enough. This wasn't a confusion anymore. It was a problem. Holt returned Pierce's identification directly to her. Then she ordered the corridor cleared. The officers stepped back, and Pierce walked out the way she should have been allowed to walk out from the beginning. But the incident didn't end when Pierce left the building. It followed them into reports, logs, and footage. Within days, the courthouse started doing what institutions always do when something goes wrong in a monitored space. They pulled records. Security cameras covered the corridor. The screening area had angles that showed the search. The radios had timestamps. The call for backup had language in it. And Pierce's recording captured the part the cameras couldn't capture perfectly: tone, sequence, and the way the officer's story evolved once the credentials hit the floor. Danner and Reese quickly realized their original narrative didn't fit the evidence. So the language in their paperwork shifted. What had been described out loud as a suspicious impersonator started turning into softer phrasing. They leaned on the most common defense used when there's no real justification. They claimed they were acting in good faith for safety, that they needed to verify, and that Pierce was uncooperative. But the footage didn't support that. The footage showed Pierce standing composed. It showed her handing over identification. It showed the corridor blocked. It showed her belongings dumped. It showed the moment the credentials appeared. And it showed the officers escalating after proof, not before it. The radio logs also didn't help them. The way Danner framed the call made it clear he was building suspicion, not responding to it. The timing showed how quickly it moved from questions to control. And multiple staff members confirmed what the cameras already suggested. Pierce was not acting erratic, not threatening, not trying to access anything she shouldn't. She was trying to leave. Once the internal review began, it became less about Pierce's status and more about the officer's conduct. That mattered because the defense they hoped to hide behind, we didn't know who she was, wasn't enough. Even if she weren't a judge, the stop still needed a legal basis. The search still needed consent or cause. The detention still needed justification. The impersonation claim still needed facts. And none of those pieces existed. Over the next several weeks, the consequences moved in layers. First came administrative action, formal complaints, review interviews, and command staff asking questions that couldn't be dodged with vague verification talk. Then came discipline measures depending on what internal policy and oversight required: remedial training, suspension, removal from certain posts, and performance review flags that don't disappear. Then the legal layer tightened. Once you have unlawful detention, unlawful search, and an attempted false story, it stops being a small HR issue. It becomes liability. It becomes civil rights exposure. It becomes the kind of case that forces a department to explain itself with evidence, not excuses. Pierce didn't go on a media tour. She didn't need attention. She needed accountability and documentation. She filed the right reports, preserved her evidence, and let the system face the facts it created on camera. Because it happened in a courthouse, one of the most recorded government spaces that exists, the usual "it's your word against ours" didn't work. Policy changes came quietly, the way institutional changes usually do. Clearer after-hours exit protocols, rules about when ID can be held and for how long, mandatory supervisor involvement if a staff member or official is stopped without a specific call for service, documentation requirements for any property search, training updates that focused on one key point. Suspicion isn't a feeling you get to act on. It's something you have to justify. Pierce walked away with a blunt reminder. Status doesn't prevent profiling. A robe doesn't stop someone from deciding you don't belong. Titles don't protect you in the moment. What protects you is composure, boundaries, and proof. Because in the end, what started as a basic hallway encounter turned into a documented example of how fast verify can become detain, how fast detain can become search, and how fast search can become a false accusation when someone needs to protect their pride. And that's the lesson. When power acts reckless, it depends on silence. When truth has evidence, power has to answer. Now tell me this. What would you have done in Judge Alana Pierce's position? Would you have recorded, demanded a supervisor, or tried to leave? Drop your answer in the comments. And if you want more real, grounded storytime cases where accountability wins, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one.
We got a call, someone waving a gun. You match the description. I need your ID.
What description? I'm sitting here minding
Black
my
shirt,
business.
black glasses, that's you. Hand over your license.
No, I don't have to give you ID just because you walked up here. I didn't do anything.
If you keep getting into it, it's going to get worse for you.
Don't threaten me for saying no. You're turning this into something it doesn't have to be, and you know it.
Imagine sitting on a park bench doing absolutely nothing. And the next thing you know, an officer is standing over you saying, you match the description. Not your face, not your height, not anything specific. Just your shirt and your glasses. And the scariest part? The moment you refuse to play along, the officer doesn't just get annoyed. He starts building a case out loud, right there in front of everyone, like he's writing your future in real time. All right, quickly, where are you watching from? What country or state? And if you like stories where staying calm and knowing your rights actually changes the outcome, hit like and subscribe, because these situations are way more common than people think. Now, here's what really happened. Edward Hale had been sitting on a bench in the middle stretch of the park, the area where the path stayed busy and people drifted past, without paying attention to anyone else. Black t-shirt, black framed glasses, phone in his hand. Nothing dramatic. Just a guy taking a break. Officer Grant Tiller walked up like he'd already decided what he was looking at. He told Edward he matched a description from a call, someone waving a gun, and he tried to turn that into an ID check immediately. Edward didn't stand up. He didn't get loud. He simply refused and made it clear there was no reason to hand over identification when he was sitting there minding his business. Tiller didn't move on from it. He repeated the matches the description line, as if saying it enough times would make it a legal basis. He said he just needed to make sure Edward wasn't armed. Edward answered that he wasn't, and he didn't add anything else. Then Tiller pushed for a driver's license anyway, like Edward had been pulled over, like the bench was a traffic stop. Edward refused again. That's when Tiller's tone shifted into pressure. He warned Edward that if he kept getting into it, it would get worse for him. And when Edward shifted even slightly, normal body movement, nothing sudden, Tiller reacted like it was suspicious, demanding to know what he was reaching for and why he was moving. Edward didn't give him the satisfaction of performing fear. He kept his boundary and treated the questions for what they were, fishing. Tiller stepped back and keyed his radio. And this was the moment the encounter started turning dangerous, not because anything new happened, but because of how it was being framed. Over the radio, Tiller described Edward as uncooperative in a weapon investigation, emphasized refusal to provide a license, and requested backup and a supervisor. While they waited, the argument got sharper. Edward accused Tiller of getting physical, putting hands on him. Edward warned that if the officer touched him again, it wouldn't end well. Tiller treated that warning as a threat and said so out loud, right there, locking the moment into a narrative that could justify escalation. Edward made it clear he was recording. He said the badge number was on camera. He said everything was on camera, and that mattered because it changed who had control of the story. When the second unit finally arrived, Tiller immediately delivered his version. Gun call, matching description, refusal to cooperate, refusal to be checked, refusal to show ID. Edward interrupted and said he answered questions, but didn't have to hand over identification. And he repeated that the officer had been aggressive and touched him for no reason. Edward also stated he was a lawyer, less as a flex, more as a warning that this wouldn't stay a park argument. The supervisor didn't match Tiller's energy. They listened, looked at Edward, looked at the scene, and didn't treat the bench like a battlefield. After a short evaluation, the supervisor ended it. Edward was told he was free to go. And even though the confrontation kept ending messy, with yelling, insults, and Edward talking about court, the most important part was simple. The stop didn't go anywhere. Because it couldn't. The second unit didn't arrive like a rescue, it arrived like a reset. Sergeant Dana Ruiz stepped in and did the first thing Officer Tiller hadn't done yet. They looked at the whole scene like it was a public space, not a private showdown. Ruiz clocked the details fast. Edward still seated, no crowd panic, no one pointing, no frantic caller waiting to identify the guy with the gun. Just an officer standing rigid and a man holding his ground with a phone camera angled up. Tiller started talking immediately, trying to control the narrative before Ruiz could build their own. He framed it as a weapon call first, then layered the rest underneath. Edward matched the description. Edward refused to cooperate. Edward refused ID. Edward wouldn't let him check him. It was the kind of explanation that sounded solid, until someone asked what it was actually built on. Ruiz didn't match the tone. They didn't raise their voice. They didn't get pulled into the ego part. They asked for specifics, not what happened, but what can you articulate? Ruiz asked what the description was beyond clothing. Tiller repeated the clothing. Ruiz asked if dispatch gave anything else. Height, build, age, direction of travel, anything distinguishing. Tiller didn't have much. Ruiz asked Seed if Tiller had seen a weapon. No. Ruiz asked if any witness on scene was identifying Edward right now. No. Ruiz asked where the waving happened and whether the caller stayed to point anyone out. Tiller's answer made it clear the caller was gone or never visible. Then Ruiz asked the question that changed the temperature. What exactly did Edward do that made him a safety risk in this moment? Something beyond refusing an ID request. Tiller tried to use Edward's refusal as the risk itself. The logic was basically, he won't identify himself, so he might be the one. Ruiz didn't accept that. Not outwardly, not with a lecture, just with silence and another question. They asked about hands, about waistband, about bulges, about any specific movement that indicated access to a weapon. Tiller pointed to Edward shifting, asking what he was reaching for. Ruiz looked at Edward's hands and then looked at the phone. And this is where the tiny detail mattered, because Edward wasn't just recording with his phone. He was recording in a way that forced his hands to stay visible. One hand holding the phone, the other open, not buried in pockets, not hidden under the bench. And because he'd kept that posture from the start, the officer couldn't honestly claim a sudden lunge or a furtive grab without risking a direct contradiction on video. That tiny choice, how he held the phone in his hands, quietly removed one of the most common excuses officers lean on when things escalate. I thought he was reaching. Ruiz saw it. Ruiz also saw something else. The park had people. Multiple angles. An older woman walking the loop had been filming too. Steady and silent, not performing, just documenting. A couple of passers-by had slowed down long enough to take out their phones. Even if nobody spoke up, the moment wasn't private anymore. And in a situation like this, privacy is where bad decisions breathe. Ruiz turned to Edward and asked the kind of questions that lowered the pressure without rewarding the officer's approach. They checked whether Edward had a weapon. Edward again stated he didn't. Ruiz watched how he answered. Measured, controlled, irritated but not erratic. Tiller tried to pull it back into authority. He kept circling to the ID. He kept implying that a refusal itself was suspicious. He kept trying to turn, "I want your ID," into, "You must." Edward didn't budge. He didn't try to impress the supervisor. He didn't over-explain. He kept it tight. He was sitting there, he had no weapon, and he wasn't handing over ID just because someone said he matched black shirt, black glasses. Then Edward dropped the point that really mattered, not as a speech, but as a boundary. He said he was prepared to take it to court, and he had everything recorded, including the earlier contact when Tiller put hands on him. That was the second tiny detail. Because hands on me changes how supervisors hear the rest. It turns an awkward stop into a potential complaint with a timeline. It turns a vague call into a use of force question. Why did contact happen? What policy allowed it? What did you perceive at the moment you touched him? Ruiz didn't argue about it on the sidewalk. They didn't need to. They just started steering the scene toward the safest exit. Ruiz told Tiller to step back, subtle but clear. They told Edward he was free to go. Not, "You're lucky," not, "Do me a favor," not, "Next time," just, "You're free to go." That one sentence was Ruiz signaling something important without saying it out loud. There wasn't enough here to lawfully force the ID, and there wasn't enough here to justify turning this into a search without creating a bigger problem for the department than the original call. Tiller didn't like it. He wanted the win. He wanted compliance he could point to. He wanted Edward to feel small before he left. But supervisors don't always care about wins. They care about what survives review. Edward stood up slowly, still recording, making sure there was no sudden movement to be interpreted for him. He left with the kind of controlled anger that's more dangerous to a bad cop than shouting, because controlled anger gets organized. It gets timestamped. It gets filed. The ending in the park still sounded messy. Raised voices. The officer telling him to leave. Edward talking about court. But the outcome was already decided. Edward walked away without cuffs, and the officer walked away with a problem that didn't end when the bench line disappeared behind them. Because once you've been recorded trying to turn a vague description into an ID demand, and once a supervisor has to shut it down, there's a trail, and trails lead places. By that evening, the park bench stop stopped being a moment and turned into a file. Edward didn't just have a clip. He had a clean timeline. The approach, the description, the ID demand, the escalation language, the radio framing, the hands-on contact accusation, and then the supervisor ending it. It wasn't cinematic. It was worse than that, because it was ordinary. He trimmed the video the way people do when they want the truth to land, not with the dramatic edits, but with the parts that showed pattern. The repeated matches the description. The jump from gun call to ID, the it'll get worse. The radio call that painted him as a threat. Then he posted it. Not with a long caption, not with a speech. Just enough context to lock the facts in place. A weapon call with a vague description, an ID demand, escalation after refusal, supervisor arrival, and release. And once it hit the local feed, it moved fast for one reason. People recognized it. Not Edward specifically, the dynamic. Comment sections filled with the same theme in different words. People describing how refusing turned into suspicious, how officer safety became a blank check, how vague descriptions were used like permission slips. But Edward didn't rely on comments. He relied on paperwork. The next morning, he did what most people don't do because it's tedious and unglamorous. He built the paper trail while the department's memory was still fresh. He filed a complaint that matched the footage minute by minute. He wrote it like someone who expected it to be reviewed by a supervisor, an internal affairs investigator, and possibly a city attorney. No exaggeration, no insults, just actions, quotes paraphrased, and times. He also requested records, dispatch call notes, CAD logs, body-worn camera footage from both officers, any incident or field interview card generated, any mention of threat documented after Edward warned the officer not to touch him again, any supervisor notes explaining why the stop was ended. And here's where the chess game shifted again. Records requests force a department to choose between two uncomfortable options: admit the stop had no legs or invent legs after the fact, and risk contradicting video. Meanwhile, the video kept spreading locally. A neighborhood page posted it. A community safety group reposted it with a short summary. A local civil rights attorney reshared it and asked for witnesses who recorded. The older woman from the park, quiet recorder, ended up in Edward's messages with her own angle, steadier and wider than his, showing the posture, the distance, and how the scene looked to passers-by. 2 cameras, 2 angles, same story. That second video mattered because it removed a common defense. The idea that the citizen's camera started late or missed what happened right before. Her angle showed the before and during, and it showed something simple. Edward wasn't charging at anyone. He wasn't hiding. He wasn't acting like someone waving a gun. He was sitting until the officer turned it into a standoff. Within a week, the department couldn't treat it like a private complaint anymore. A city council staffer asked the department for a briefing. Not because council staffers love work, but because public clips like that trigger calls, emails, and community meetings. Local reporters sent questions. The department's public information office did what they always do first, asked for time, said they were reviewing, reminded everyone the call involved a possible weapon. But that line didn't land the way it used to. Because Edward's video didn't show an officer carefully investigating a threat. It showed an officer trying to control a man with an ID demand and building a weapon call narrative when the man didn't comply. And people could feel the difference. Internally, the attention hit Officer Tiller in small ways first. A supervisor asked for a summary of the stop written. Another supervisor pulled his Bodycam tag and made sure it was uploaded. A sergeant who hadn't been at the scene asked why the stop didn't develop beyond clothing description. The same word kept coming up in those internal conversations. Articulation. What did he have specifically? Because black shirt, black glasses didn't articulate reasonable suspicion by itself in a crowded park, not when half the park could be dressed the same. Not when there was no witness pointing, not when there was no observed weapon, not when the call was vague and the officer didn't confirm details before escalating. Then there was the radio framing. Departments care about officer language on the air because it becomes the first version of the report. If the first version is inflated, everything after it looks like cover. And when a supervisor releases the person at the scene, it tells reviewers the officer's framing didn't match the reality. And then came the one detail that turned this from questionable to liability in the eyes of admin, the hands-on contact allegation. Even if nobody could prove it yet, it forced an inquiry. Because if a citizen says an officer put hands on them without justification, and the rest of the stop doesn't have clean legal footing, investigators don't shrug it off. They pull Bodycam. They pull GPS. They check policies about detentions, searches, and escalation language. They don't do it out of kindness. They do it because lawsuits cost money. By the second week, Edward received what departments often send when they know something's hot: a formal acknowledgement letter. It didn't admit anything. It didn't apologize. It confirmed the complaint was received and under review. At the same time, the online story evolved. People tried to make Edward the hero, but he didn't let that become the focus. He kept redirecting it back to the point. Vague descriptions used as excuses, Idaho demands without clear basis, an escalation when someone refuses. He also made a deliberate choice. He stopped arguing with strangers online. Instead, he met with a civil rights attorney in person, not to talk big, but to make sure every step was done correctly. Preserving video, preserving witness contact, documenting emotional and professional impact, and preparing for the city's predictable responses. And the attorney told him the truth most people don't hear until it's too late. The wind wasn't yelling on the sidewalk. The wind was making the department answer in writing. Because once you force answers in writing, people can't pretend they didn't know what happened. That's when the department made its first real move. Not public, but internal. Officer Tiller was quietly instructed to route stops like that through a supervisor sooner. His proactive contacts were reduced. He wasn't punished on paper yet, just managed, watched, guided. The kind of administrative tightening that looks like nothing until you realize it's the department protecting itself from you. And Edward could tell it was working because the department's tone changed. They stopped leaning so hard on the gun call as a shield and started talking about community concerns, communication, and reviewing procedures. That language meant one thing. They didn't want this turning into a pattern story. But the truth was, it already had. Because Edward didn't just have footage. He had a supervisor on camera ending the stop. And that, more than anything, was the department's problem. Weeks later, the park bench moment didn't live in the park anymore. It lived in files, inboxes, and review folders. Edward didn't treat it like a viral clip. He treated it like evidence. He packaged everything, his full recording, timestamps, the supervisor's arrival, the radio framing, and the exact point where the stop ended because it couldn't legally go anywhere. He added the second angle from the older woman who had been filming quietly. Then he did the part most people skip. He made it formal. A complaint went in with a clean timeline. Records requests followed right behind it, dispatch notes, CAD logs, both officers' body cam, and any internal report created off that gun call. And once those requests hit the department, the story stopped being emotional and started being measurable. Because now the city had to answer one question in writing. What was the lawful basis for turning black shirt and black glasses into an ID demand and an escalation threat? Inside the department, the review didn't look like justice. It looked like risk management. Supervisors pulled the footage and compared it to the call details. They listened to the radio traffic, especially how Officer Tiller framed Edward as uncooperative in a weapon investigation. They watched the moment the supervisor arrived and ended it. And the more they watched, the clearer it got. The stop didn't collapse because Edward got lucky. It collapsed because the foundation was thin. That's where the consequences started, quietly. Officer Tiller didn't get a public spectacle. Instead, he got the kind of discipline departments prefer because it leaves less public footprint, increased oversight, corrective counseling, and mandatory training. His discretionary stops got scrutinized. His reports got read harder. And in the months after, his supervisors made sure he wasn't freelancing the same way, especially on calls involving vague descriptions. In other words, he got put on a shorter leash. Then the department did what departments do when a clip exposes a pattern. They issued internal guidance. Officers were reminded that vague clothing descriptions alone didn't equal reasonable suspicion and that ID just because I said so wasn't a lawful shortcut. Weapon calls required corroboration, something observable, something specific, or a witness who could actually identify the subject. They also pushed a message about language. Escalation talk like, "It'll get worse," created problems because it sounded like punishment for exercising rights, and it played terribly on camera. Even the park patrol routine shifted. People who spent time there noticed it first. Officers started approaching slower, explaining more, keeping more distance. Stops that would have turned into arguments before got redirected into questions that ended quicker, because now everyone knew cameras were part of the environment. As for Edward, he didn't walk away feeling victorious. He walked away feeling clear. He got confirmation that the complaint was processed. He got records back that matched what he already knew. And behind the scenes, the city pushed toward resolution the way cities do when they don't want a courtroom replay of a bad stop. Quiet negotiation, controlled language, and a settlement-style outcome that didn't admit wrongdoing, but still acknowledged cost. So here's the question. If you were sitting there and an officer tried to turn your clothes into a description, would you hand over ID just to make it end? Or would you hold your line and record it? Drop your answer in the comments. Share this with somebody who needs it, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more story times where accountability actually shows up.